Welcome to The Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm Maz, and I speak to soldiers, academics, refugees, peacemakers, and anyone else who's been touched by war in the hope of demystifying and, most importantly, de-glorifying it. If you like what you hear, please consider showing your support by reviewing the show wherever you get your pods. You can also support us on our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today is Carl Miller, who is the co-founder of the Centre for Analysis of Social Media at Demos, the first UK think tank institute dedicated to studying the digital world. For the past 9 years, he's been its research director, building new machine learning-driven approaches to robustly study online life, and has written over 20 major studies spanning online electoral interference, radicalization, digital politics, conspiracy theories, cybercrime, and internet governance. His debut book, The Death of the Gods, The New Global Power Grab, was published in 2018 and won the 2019 Transmission Prize. He presents programs for the BBC's flagship technology show, Click, and has written for Wired, New Scientist, The Sunday Times, The Telegraph, and The Guardian. He's a visiting research fellow at King's College London, a senior fellow at the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, a fellow at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, an associate of the Imperial War Museum, and a member of the Society Board of the British Computing Society. He joins me today to discuss information warfare, cyber attacks, weaponization of social media, and other challenges, as well as opportunities brought about by the internet, and to do so with a particular focus on what we are seeing play out as a result of the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Carl, thank you very much for joining me on The Voices of War.
Maz, hi there. Thanks so much for having me today.
So before we get into the, murky waters of the ongoing information war around Ukraine, maybe a little bit about your rather eclectic career. How did you end up doing the work that you do?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I asked myself that more than once. So, I mean, like many things, not really planned out, but really just one thing leading to another. So my background really is as a think tanker. So I've worked for 12 years now for a think tank called Demos, which is kind of one of the kind of standard political think tanks based in Westminster here in London. Mm-hmm. I joined that actually coming out of a kind of internship in the Foreign Office looking at counterterrorism and counter-radicalization. And I joined the kind of counter-violence team at Demos. Wow. We wrote a pamphlet back in 2010, basically saying all terrorists and violent extremists are also conspiracy theorists. It was a kind of link which hadn't been made too much at that point, and we were very interested in it and kind of trying to explore how it, actually being conspiracy theorists might create all kinds of dynamics, kind of both personal and group, which would actually lead you down pathways of radicalization. Unfortunately, the 9/11 truth movement in the UK thought I was saying all conspiracy theorists are terrorists. So began kind of 2 years of kind of angry debate with them. And over those 2 years, I realized that this was a movement that was almost entirely living online. They organized, this was before Twitter, but this was on David Icke's forum and InfoWars forum. But they were organizing unbelievably effectively, extremely galvanized, very energetic as a movement. And that began, I suppose, with me and my colleagues, this kind of realization of just how important the internet was to changing the nature of social movements and groups. Plus, of course, as a researcher, I love data. And so as we realized that not only was social media a huge agent of social change, it was changing all of us, it's changing the environment around us, but also it was producing these amazing, unbelievable new data sets that we could actually study all of that with, then I thought that was the kind of research challenge of a generation, really, that my generation was responsible for and tasked with this massive challenge of how to make sense of all this data. So, and one thing led to another, and here we are, a decade later.
Yeah, and a number of TEDx talks, a book, and probably another one in the making, and certainly quite prominent in this social media space yourself. There were a couple of things that you just brought up that were really interesting. First one is that terrorists are conspiracy theorists. That's a really, I can't say I've actually, it makes absolute sense, but I can't say I've actually ever thought about it that way. Why would you put those two together? What is it that makes a terrorist a conspiracy theorist? Because we come to know terrorists as, it's political violence. It's, it's the result of the oppressed, arguably, who don't have another means to prosecute their political aims. Why do you link those two?
Well, it was exactly actually the strange association of both of those two things in the same people, which got me interested in the idea. Exactly, and that's exactly what the pamphlet tries to explain. What we end up with, and it was co-written by a colleague of mine called Jamie Bartlett. What we end up with was the idea that conspiracy theories are a kind of radicalizing multiplier. They do all kinds of things actually, which make it more likely for someone to become a violent extremist. They're a spur to action in some ways. So if you really believe that you need to kind of wake up a benighted sheeple from their kind of slumber of the mainstream media and kind of corporate kind of politico elites, then sometimes a spectacular act of resistance is what's required. So they kind of spur people into action. But they also actually create a bunch of group dynamics which make it more likely for a group to be kind of hived off from any kind of mainstream or countervailing information and go down a particular rabbit hole. So it's a lot easier for a leader of a group to kind of squash dissent within the group by if every member of the group believes that there might be an infiltration by a CIA agent or an MI6 agent. And of course, if you believe that you're being there's a conspiracy, a kind of dark plot against you, which in some cases, obviously, in violent extremist groups, there actually are plots to infiltrate them. It makes you kind of far more inclined to adopt all kinds of operational secrecies and hermetic seals. So right, all of those things together, basically, I don't really think. Of course, the vast majority of conspiracy theorists, just to go back to that earlier confusion that really began my foray into the internet, the vast majority of conspiracy theorists are not violent extremists. They might be 9/11 Truth Movement, they might believe in QAnon, but they're not actually in any, that doesn't necessarily mean that they believe that, indiscriminate violence is either legitimate or necessary to achieve a political end. But certainly, being a conspiracy theorist helps if you are going down that pathway. That was the kind of conclusion. Right.
And I guess the behaviors of it, the conspiracy theories will motivate you greater, because I guess once you start self-policing within your chosen social group, you start embodying that the norms of that group, and it I guess becomes part of your identity. And I guess this is why debunking or talking to somebody who has gone down a rabbit hole of a particular conspiracy theory becomes so hard, because they become so wedded to the idea, and of course the idea of autonomy. Right, you can't fool me. So there's a kind of a kind of cognitive leap that needs to be made for somebody who has gone down that rabbit hole to actually step outside of their own identity that have chosen to embrace. Have you found that?
That's right. I mean, that is one of the most infuriating things, really, about that anyone has found who has spent any time trying to debunk or argue with conspiracy theorists is simply the self-sealing nature, as you said, of all those ideas. So when there is, a government kind of media alliance, as so many conspiracy theorists believe there is, to refute and cover up, the real existence of 9/11 or the role of the Illuminati in modern affairs or anything like that, then of course they're going to produce evidence which undermines your theory. Of course they're going to be able to control experts. Of course they're going to be able to control journalists. And really it's kind of like almost like the only kind of idea where evidence to the contrary is taken as evidence of the actual existence of the conspiracy itself.
Yeah.
It's really, really infuriating. But I would say also one thing I did learn spending spending the years that I did talking to the 9/11 truth movement, is that a lot of this isn't really acting on the level of like rational thought. So what I found was that this is as much to do with kind of identity, and actually this is a point I'll make again when it comes to information warfare, perhaps. This is as much to do with identity and belonging and kinship and friendship as it is to do with evidence and reason. So I remember being involved in a big debate in London with a kind of celebrity conspiracy theorist, and people would turn up with like, to cheer on their side, and they were wearing t-shirts with kind of truth seeker on the front, and they knew each other, they were friends with each other. They'd go down the pub afterwards and have a pint. They were selling t-shirts in the back of the room and tapes and memorabilia, and it was like going to a kind of like a concert, where you could buy like the merch of your favorite band. So there's lots of social and emotional ties, I think, of people to that. And what better way of finding meaning in the world than truly believing that you're part of a tiny chosen few who can really see the true nature of world affairs. I mean, that is a huge way of carving out a role for yourself in a world that often gives far too little meaning to people.
Yeah, and is there a particular profile of a person that you have found that is more susceptible to conspiratorial thinking than others?
Well, I did actually. I wrote quite an angry and I think probably in retrospect fairly rude article trying to called a beastery of the 9/11 movement, where I tried to divide it into the different groups. I thought that looking back at kind of 22-year-old Carl, that was probably slightly unnecessary, but yes, no, certainly there are different like tribes, if you will, that join up. There's kind of this is all generalizing, of course, but there were definitely kind of 20-something kind of postmodern aligned students that are questioning truth in general. There's definitely kind of people with, I suppose, like both genuinely hard left and hard right beliefs that kind of go into conspiracy theories already with the belief that the state is unrecoverably corrupt and compromised. There's kind of a kind of older kind of conspiracy theorists as well that I don't want to sound rude, but just has an enormous amount of time on their hands and has kind of become a kind of expert in a particular, say, niche within the field, in the same way that one would become an expert in a niche in any area of life. So for instance, like a former physics teacher who would write about the kind of melting point of steel, in the peer-reviewed journal that the 9/11 Truth Movement would maintain, and that would and would therefore have something of a kind of currency and a following within that community. So yeah, it brought, and a lot of people that, yeah, as I said, I think are just very angry with the state, the establishment, mainstream media, sometimes from a completely personal experience, say of being very wrongly treated by, say, a journalist, and that leading to believe that journalism is corrupt, which leads them to believe, well, what else are they saying, which is lies, and so on. Right. And a final group would be the utterly self-seeking, profit-minded, which we cannot deny. Economic incentives are always very powerful ones, and that there would always be a kind of few voices in these debates that would be, would have held, or at least claimed to have held some kind of position in the CIA or some position in the FBI, and they would immediately become celebrities in this world, and they would immediately monetize it, and they would be the people selling the t-shirts in the back of the room and that kind of thing. Yeah,
of course. It's incredible. I mean, I guess it's nothing new, right? I mean, conspiracy theories have always been around, but to come back to the point, what the second point that I really liked in your kind of opening answer is data and the value of data. You just mentioned before that, we're generalizing, and that's I guess the beauty of data, that it gives us sufficient data points that we can draw some patterns from it to then make some generalization about broader macro level behaviors. And exactly. This is like, yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, no, exactly right, and really, the kind of quieter kind of fascination of the last 10 years for me has actually really been around the methods and the technologies to make sense of all of that. So, me with my colleagues, it really has been like we largely formed Chasm, Centre for Now Social Media, both Chasm Technology, the company, and also in the think tank to build new ways of leveraging all that data and turning it into something which we could actually understand, amidst all the chaos, and complexity and internal contradiction which data sets that social media creates often has for us.
Yeah, and I guess that leads me into the title of your book, The Death of the Gods, the New Global Power Grab, which of course is a well-known and I think it was an international bestseller. Maybe we can just zero in what the book is about and what you mean by the death of gods, because I think this big data really speaks well to what you try to cover in the book, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Yes, well, I mean, so the book, I took a year out to write it, because at that point I'd spent maybe 5 or 6 years, and we'd been working on counterterrorism over here, and working on conspiracy theories over there, and we've been working on early disinformation operations over there, and it was a way of basically trying to construct a kind of bigger picture across the different like empirical islands of our work, so to speak, to provide a kind of more general explanation for what's going on. So it was really a book which was wrapping together data and analytics and machine learning and all the methodologies which we were developing at Chasm, with like kind of I suppose the beginning of a kind of interest that I had in kind of journalistic storytelling as well, and how to wrap kind of the stories of individual people and individual groups in amongst all of that data, and whether I could fuse those two things together. There was an idea at the heart of it, which was power. So I thought power was an idea which kind of like freedom and liberty and equality and justice. It's one of these huge unit ideas, which is so important, has been for so
emotional.
Long. It's very emotional, and it's an idea which writers have kind of always turned to actually at moments when, throughout history, their own societies are kind of locked in this kind of period of convulsive big shift. So, Machiavelli, Machiavelli did it in the Florentine Renaissance. Marx did it as he was watching his society lurch into the Industrial Revolution. Foucault did it like to make sense of the kind of liberations of the 1960s. Like all these writers that I've kind of admired so much over kind of all of my education have kind of used power to ask this question about how our lives are shaped. And so I thought, well, power seems to me to be quite an overlooked idea now, and it seems to be shifting in quite important ways in lots of different parts of life. So really the book was an endeavor to kind of go out on the road and bring myself kind of face to face with power and its shifts, whether that meant face to face with it in terms of the data or face to face with it in terms of actually seeing it happen.
And what did you find? Because I really like the title, "The Death, of the Gods." What did you find through the book?
So the gods were all those old holders of power, be it a large hierarchical company or states, or mainstream media outlets, or in many ways conventional military forces. And I imagine we'll come back to that particular claim in a little while later. And the kind of starting point was that a lot of the parts of life which we regard to be conventionally powerful have become a lot less powerful than they used to be, and a lot less powerful than perhaps we suppose they are now. But the kind of question which my editor had given me for the book was, is this, so much is quite clear really, but is this shift in power, is it liberating us or is it imprisoning us? Are we awakening in this kind of digital age actually with more power at each of our fingertips than ever before, or actually are our lives being shaped by these kind of distant, sometimes murky forces of which we don't understand? And the kind of the answer was both. Both are happening at the same time. Like there are both all these tremendous liberations, and it isn't really a book. I mean, it kind of came out at this time when there was like a tech clash happening, and there was kind of book after book coming out that was kind of criticizing the overweening power of Facebook, which my book does as well. It's hard to avoid the kind of power of the tech giants, but it wasn't simply that. There were all these amazing liberations happening at the same time across politics and journalism and business. Each one of them were causing kind of all these people who were previously powerless to kind of find new routes to power. But at the same time, there were also all of these new forces of control for sure. Mm-hmm. And the underlying explanation for both those two things happening at the same time was that I thought, and this was really this. No one needs to get the book now because I'm giving them the final page.
I'll put a link to it anyway.
Was that power had gone wild? That was the argument. So we've always tried to control power and cage it. The bars of that cage are things like, of course, the law. And professional standards and norms. We try and control, don't we, Mads, the way in which you reach into my life and I reach into yours. And we say there are certain ways where that's legitimate and certain ways where that isn't. And all the way from like embarrassment and social censure, all the way down to imprisonment, are all the kind of penalties which we levy, to try and steer people away from illegitimate and illicit ways in which we reach into each other's lives. And whether you look at the remarkable explosion of cybercrime and the sheer difficulty that law enforcement agencies have with bringing cyber criminals to any form of justice now, or whether you look at the fact that information warfare is being fought outside of the rules of war and outside of any kind of published rules of engagement, or whether you look at large companies that simply have new forms of monopoly we don't recognize yet, or whether you look at online electioneering online or entirely new forms of political parties which are setting up. Everywhere you look, power has flowed in and between those bars, and is not being controlled by them anymore.
Yeah, and I really like the fact that you're suggesting that it's flowing between. It's very easy for us, and I've just recently interviewed Peter Singer, and we talked about the democratization of war. And that's something we're seeing, particularly playing out in Ukraine. But also there's this feedback loop, right? If we just look at what we just talked about the, maybe not conspiracy theories, but the kind of pigeonholes and stovepiping that we find ourselves in, when this interplays back and forth, I also get sucked into. So while I might feel powerful for having my megaphone, I'm also, just through that megaphone, I'm also siding with a particular view, with a particular bias, and just through that alone, through the likes and shares and my inner network that I have, I'm digging a deeper and deeper hole. I guess I'm going down deeper and deeper into my own little rabbit hole of my exclusive group of people, which therefore then takes power away from me in a way, or it makes me more susceptible to manipulation by those who are, and again, without getting conspiratorial on it, but those who are, steering narratives and conversations, kind of bigger macro ones. Is that
for sure? And it's a great example. Like social media is a really great example of how that kind of liberation and new form of control come wrapped hand in hand. So of course, like we all have tremendous new capacities at our fingertips to not only capture attention and do something to the world with social media, but also to learn about it. So one of the stories in the book is about actually now a very famous individual called Elliot Higgins, who runs Bellingcat. And it was a bit more of a Bellingcat had isn't quite the kind of global brand that they are today, but they're, for those who haven't heard, they're kind of a group of kind of open source intelligence volunteers and investigators. And Elliot had begun his career unemployed in Leicester, kind of arguing in the comment threads of The Guardian, but realizing that he could learn about the Iraq and Libyan wars just as well as any journalist in the field by looking at all of the battlefield imagery that was emerging, and at that point was completely unexploited by journalists. So, he started to have like mini scoops, and then he got a really big scoop, which I think he realized it was Croatian weaponry going into Libyan rebels, and that landed him on the front page of the New York Times, and now he's a talisman, I suppose, of the open source intelligence community, and the CEO of Bellingcat. So there's a great example about a liberation, and how talent and I think honestly a kind of enormous eye to detail and a lot of time kind of transformed Bellingcat and Elliot into the kind of global force for I think good that they are now. But yeah, on the other hand, murky control, lots of murky control. Murky control from the platforms. Who's creating the content? How do the pipes work? But then also murky control from lots of actors that are actually attacking their platforms. And another murkiness in our not knowing really where the dynamic sits between the platforms trying to defend themselves and all the range of actors around the world that are trying to manipulate and subvert them. I mean, that fascinates me, that conflict. It's been a secret war, which has been, if war is quite the right metaphorical word to use, but a secret struggle that's been happening back and forth between the social media platforms and I think military states and other actors for years and years now. Very dynamic, constantly changing. And
what do you mean? Explore that a little, because I can't say I'm intimately familiar with what you're talking about.
Sure. So information warfare. Should we begin with information warfare?
Please, sounds good.
And we'll build up to that conflict. So, but let's begin. Let's begin with this shift that began to happen to operational doctrines around the world in around 2005. I place it. Others might point to slightly different times. One after the other, militaries around the world, I think both liberal democratic and autocratic alike, kind of all began essentially the same line of thinking, which was, and I'm quoting most directly here from the UK doctrine. We live in an information society, an information age, in fact. How do we as a military stay relevant in an age where information is increasingly central to everything? And each of them essentially rewrote their operational doctrines. Integrated actions, the UK's one. All of them, of course, noticing that the end of any application of controlled violence is ultimately behavioural change of some kind, or either stopping people doing something or making them do something. And they all realised that the answer was this kind of, I think, enormously important conceptual flip in what information was. So the information had long been a tool of war, and everyone recognised that. We all see the blow up tanks before Normandy. We all see crusader kings trying to manipulate the kind of enemy's picture of their own forces. It's always been used to dissimulate and confuse and convince. But all these doctrines reconceived of information not as a tool of war, but a theatre of war, a space that war, in fact, happens within. And they were quite explicit about this in many cases, air, sea, land, space, cyber, and information. And it kind of changed the kind of language that militaries began to use to talk about this. So they began to talk about it as a space, information maneuver, kind of mimetic weaponry, kind of information dominance operations, things like that. And that's where we get to this question then of this kind of conflict between, say, militaries and social media platforms. So militaries, and again, liberal democratic and autocratic alike, I think, began to then build capability to maneuver in the information space. Perhaps they kind of realized that if information is a space, then attention is the most kind of important territory within this space. And so capturing and holding attention is rather like in the information equivalent of capturing and holding a hill or a ravine or a crossing or something. And so they began to build capability, I think. We see some of this, and there's much that we don't see. To be able to maneuver across the information spaces which were most important, and that, of course, social media was part of it. We know more now about what's happening on the autocratic side of things, so that's where the story kind of becomes a bit less general. But autocratic militaries began to generate ways of being able to manipulate information flows on social media accounts, really. So that would involve mass account setup. That would involve understanding how you seed memes in certain ways to get to spread, how you would game algorithmic curation happening on social media platforms to make things more visible, or perhaps even to suppress information as well. And then, of course, the kind of slightly softer and squishier kind of questions around kind of gluing together cognitive psychology and dopamine studies and the other kind of human-centered disciplines, and understanding, well, how do we shape messaging in order to achieve the effects that we want?
To hit the right triggers,
and so the social media platforms realized that that there were all these accounts being created. I'm going back years now, but they realized that all these accounts being created, which were inauthentic in their mind, weren't who they say they were, but possibly very great in number. And initially, I think they treated this as a form of spam. So, it's like, oh, well, that we've always had
harmless spam,
Yeah. Or, it might harm user experience. So we don't want people getting loads of, like porn bots, because they won't use Twitter anymore. That's the kind of thinking, I think, in the early days, not just on Twitter, in fact, but I think this was, again, more general. But then, kind of more recently, there's been the realization that, hang on, maybe a military doing this is kind of qualitatively a kind of categorically different kind of threat to a spam agency, and setting up basically teams to defend their own platforms against this. Facebook, especially, kind of recruiting in lots of people from kind of more mil and security and intel backgrounds onto their own kind of platform integrity and safety teams, in order to basically, I think, like ultimately set up a kind of detection and enforcement response. So find it happening and then learn more about it if you can, and then respond.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting dilemma for, and when you're talking about, organizations like Facebook and Twitter and so on, I mean, and you mentioned the attention economy. I mean, that's what, it's the maintaining the eyeball on the product. That's how their algorithms are making money for them. It's to, over time, seed advertising and so on. It's very difficult to combat that, this, regardless of how many people you have, when your business model is purely designed on, eyes on. So to actually combat information or disinformation becomes very, very difficult when your entire platform depends on continuous flow of information to the end user, and the end user, purely by their likes and shares, will be driven by the very same algorithms towards a particular social group identity subset. And if I remember correctly, there were studies on I think Zeynep Tufekci done work on YouTube that 70% of the videos that are viewed on YouTube is through the right-hand side recommended videos, which is insane. Only 30% of the videos watched is what people actually go on there to watch. The rest is what's being fed through the algorithms based on what they've previously watched. And I think she also found that they become more and more extreme, as you're watching. I just don't know how you can combat that when the entire ecosystem, when the entire economic business model is really built on keeping you hooked on the platform. I wonder if you, I'm this is nothing new, but I wonder if you had any thoughts on that particular dilemma.
I do. I mean, I think the dilemma, sadly, is broader even than simply the kind of optimized for engagement algorithms. So information creation, you very correctly say, is optimized to keep people on the platform. But the entire platform is actually itself optimized for growth in a more general sense. So really, all of these platforms have been designed to be just about as frictionless as possible. Friction is a really important idea for in the world of big tech, and we don't talk about it enough outside of it, but they're obsessed with it inside. The idea that making anything slightly easier or slightly harder will have vast consequences as to whether millions of people click on something or something else. You make a box a slightly different color or slightly bigger or slightly more central. All of that. Much of this isn't really to do with making things possible or impossible. It's making things easier or more difficult.
And less off-ramps, right? Less off-ramps.
Right. So, if you want to leave Facebook, please write a letter, to a company in France, in pen and ink. And I remember when I was trying to get my data out of some companies, they literally, the digital platforms would require me to physically mail them a letter in order to get data. Wow. So, and that's friction. That for sure, that's all friction at work. But on the other side, completely frictionless is account sign up. And then actually sharing stuff, because they want to maximize both of those two things. So when it's so easy to set up accounts and there's so little information or delay or friction that's put in place of you doing that, that also is something which makes the platform more exploitable. And likewise, in terms of actually sharing things, there's all kinds of frictions to be put in place around, dampening down virals about the war, which we don't know whether they're right or not, or causing people to delay before they can share something, or capping the amount of sharing activity that each account can actually do. There's all kinds of friction that you might put in place, which isn't put in place in many ways. I think that my reading is that these conversations take the form of a struggle which tends to be happening on the inside of each of the tech giants. You definitely have voices, especially on the kind of policy, legal, and kind of safety and security sides of the companies that would love more friction. It's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to catch Russian disinformation operations if you ask people for more identifying information about themselves, for instance. It's a lot easier if you just shut off account creation, say on a particular IP range. There might be compromised. There's all kinds of technical things you can do,
or the amount of shares you can do per day, or
which I think is notionally capped, but it's at some sort of ridiculously high level that doesn't seem to have much meaningful kind of effect at all in the kind of campaigns that we see. But on the other side of the fence, you've got kind of growth and revenue, and their incentives are obviously to get these platforms as big as possible and as profitable as possible. And they're never going to want anything other than frictionless experiences, because friction stands in the way of all of that.
That's very interesting. And I remember just recently I was listening to a podcast, Tristan Harris's podcast, Your Undivided Attention. And I forget the name of the person he had on, but he was, in fact, there were two from China, and he was talking about, the Chinese, I think it was Wechat, which has actually got quite a lot of restrictions like the ones you mentioned in there. And the user experience is overall, by the sounds of it, actually quite better. Of course, the virality of particular information is nowhere near as great, and the penetration into the network is far more tightly controlled. But at least from these two people that Tristan Harris had on, their analysis was that the user experience is actually a lot better and in many ways even safer, which is really strange to hear, given that it's we're talking about something we would describe as an autocratic state like China.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point. And I think it reflects another as well, which is, of course, that, the Chinese state has been much more willing to involve itself in questions of platform engineering. I mean, in the kind of, the kind of Western conversations around platform governance, a lot of it, far too much of the conversation, in my view, has been really kind of concentrated on moderation and kind of takedown, so finding and removing content which is illegal, hate speech, and so on, which is fine, but it hasn't concerned itself with everything that we're talking about here. So
it's not structural, right? There are no structural changes there.
It's not structural. It's not systemic, and it's only very it's only very surface levels, and there's much more that states could do, for instance, to force Facebook or Twitter or a YouTube or a Reddit into making themselves harder targets for information operations if they require these platforms to put in place certain systemic changes, structural and algorithmic and curative changes to make them more difficult. I would say also, whilst we're on the topic of Chinese social media platforms, TikTok obviously is the one which is actually used by tons of Western audiences. Right now, we can, as researchers, we cannot legitimately get any kind of scale data from TikTok.
Oh, wow.
So we have no idea how much information operations is happening on TikTok. And that is terrifying to me. Because I get all kinds of anecdotal accounts of very mimetic, sometimes quite shocking, extremely graphic pro-invasion messaging happening on TikTok all the time. We know, obviously, that much like the White House, the Russian state has recruited TikTok influencers, so they know how important this is as a battleground. And there is no real way in which civic society and academic researchers can do anything more than, anecdotal, qualitative research. And that to me is completely, it's madness that in 2022, we're still in a state where civic society is blind to the possible scale of disinformation on a platform which is now really central to our media diet.
The size of TikTok, which is wow, that's incredible. And that's maybe an interesting pivot. In fact, just one other question, if you can just clarify for me before we then pivot onto Ukraine and Russia, because that's certainly an area I want to explore. I remember also hearing or reading somewhere that it was 2009 and 2012 that Facebook and Twitter respectively introduced the like and the share button. The years I might be off. Someone's probably going to fact check me on it, but it's around then anyway. And that it was actually that really changed the game. What do you think about that? Is that, and maybe if that is the case, why did that change the game so much?
It's really hard to say, to be honest, as an external researcher, exactly what the inputs to these. Presumably, what you mean there is it changes the game because it changes the way that information flows. So, or it changes
the user engagement, I think, also, and the how much you're no longer passive. You are now an active participant in this network, in this, as a node within the network.
For sure. I mean, super important. Of course, super important. Very hard to my sense is that the kind of algorithms flow back and forth and are kind of constantly tweaked all the time. I actually, to me, the one bit of kind of algorithmic curation around 2012 that's probably the most important is actually the one you already mentioned around YouTube recommended videos, because it's absolutely true to say that over that time, people were being led into more and more extreme content. And if you look at the kind of emergence of kind of extremist political parties, from online venues, they all basically came out of YouTube. And this kind of conception that we have of kind of this kind of liberal idea that good ideas tend to win out over bad ideas in this kind of even contest. It wasn't an even contest. Like absolutely enormous amounts of exposure was given to a series of niche ideas, which I think has caused a kind of traumatic series of kind of cultural shifts, which we're still living with now. I mean, YouTube quite drastically changed the way that they were recommending videos in the years subsequent. But I think the damage at that point was done, and a lot of these channels had already garnered very, very large subscription bases, and we're living with those consequences now. So that one to me is one of the saddest episodes, I suppose, in recent history of just how kind of important the kind of cultural consequences can be of something which seems as banal and simple as just a series of videos to watch next.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talked about power before. I mean, that is incredible power when you're aware of those networks, and of course the reach of those networks, and of course seeding ideas is therefore becomes quite easy. But that may be an interesting place to also pivot to Ukraine and what we're seeing going on right now, because we are seeing a new changed application of power, but also of politics. I think we're seeing that play out in Ukraine. As I mentioned before, I had Peter Singer on the show a few days ago, and we explored how Ukraine won the information war. But what we didn't really discuss is that it has done so only in the West, largely, because of course that's what I'm exposed to, and that's what I'm seeing in my Twitter feed and so on. But your current research shows something very, very different when we're looking at the BRICS countries, which of course is the acronym for the 5 major emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So how is the current war in Ukraine perceived in the BRICS countries?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been somewhat uncomfortable, to be honest, with this idea that Ukraine has obviously won the information war. It's always struck me as actually being, I mean, with all due respect, Peter Singer, fairly complacent idea that it has. And I'm not necessarily sure that it has. And it felt to me, and it wasn't just obviously a single voice. There was tons of media talking about the kind of success of Kiev's information warfare and how Putin had left his propagandists in the lurch, and they didn't know who's going to be on the Donbass. This is another consequence of secrecy and war planning and so on. And it felt to me a lot like it's felt in the 2016 presidential election, and it felt during Brexit. And it's felt at other times when we are in information spaces which we believe are far more general than they actually are. So we're surrounded by pro-Ukraine solidarity. There is not a single pro-Russian voice in my timeline on any social media.
That is so interesting, because tomorrow we might wake up, it'll be like, I don't know any Trump voters who voted for Trump. It's
that's exactly what it was like.
Yeah, right.
And no one could believe it. No one could believe that that the UK voted to Brexit. There was not a single Brexit voice in my timeline either. I'm a centre-left think tanker that lives in London. Of course there isn't. Everyone that I know was ardently Remain.
Yeah, of course.
So it felt slightly like that again. So that's but of course it's just a hunt. So that's where the kind of actual data and analysis comes in. So the idea was essentially to focus on the kind of the obvious, the most obvious, I would say, kind of Russian influence operation to date. It was in fact actually our research wasn't actually disposed to provide more evidence that it was a Russian influence operation. I was kind of taking that as a given, to be honest, going into the research. There'd already been research by Mark Owen Jones and by the DFR Lab and Atlantic Council and others who had noticed that around these 2 hashtags, hashtag I stand with Putin, hashtag I stand with Russia, don't use them anyone, just makes them trend again. Around those 2 hashtags, they both started trending on March 2nd, March 3rd. And there was all this. I'd read a piece in the Times of London where they'd written up the fact that it was trending in India as an example of anti-colonial sentiment in India.
As in born in India. Is that what he was trying to say? That it was domestically kind of.
It was saying
driven.
Hashtag I stand with Putin's trending in India, and India's quite anti-colonial, and maybe India isn't behind, behind Ukraine at all. That was the kind of nature of the article. And already this research had emerged actually on that day and the day after, which had noticed kind of suspicious patterns in the account behaviors of accounts that were using those hashtags. There's lots of things that us researchers look at to try and identify an influence operation. And normally a series of kind of interlocking patterns which are very different from normal organic versions of those patterns, together is the nearest that we can get. So loads of accounts set up on the day of the invasion. Loads of accounts, all the other accounts set up like very recently, or the vast majority of them. Extremely high retweet to tweet ratios. And Mark Owen Jones had noticed that the profile pictures, some of the profile pictures of the account showing the hashtag had been used in romance scams beforehand. And there were extremely dense retweet networks, meaning that all the same messages were being retweeted by all of these accounts. Like you don't expect organic social media is noisy and contradictory and very human and it just doesn't have kind of like clear patternation like that. So really we stepped in to do research which was kind of presuming that there was a Russian influence operation, that it probably mixed together some automation, some human activity, some accounts which were compromised, some accounts which might be being paid to engage. Typically these campaigns have all these things overlapping, but we wanted to try and learn more about the accounts that were pumping these hashtags. So we did lots of data wrangling, collected 20 odd million tweets, hundreds of thousands of Twitter accounts, and then winnowed it down to 10,000 accounts that had shared the hashtag more than 5 or more times. So not the whole network for sure, but we thought a pretty high signal part of the network. These accounts are really pumping out the hashtag. And then we did actually a new technique. We haven't really done this very much. It's a technique that my colleagues Chris and David have pioneered, which is called semantic profiling or semantic fingerprinting. It's a application of a kind of new part of natural language processing. I won't get into too much technical detail as you want me to, Mads, but essentially it uses one of the new models, deep learning models, which Google has developed. And it can allow you to build a much more general picture of someone's language use. So typically, normally in this world of research, we might build an algorithm which is like, are you talking about politics? Yes or no? Are you talking about sport? Yes or no? We shape these algorithms, and they can then make that decision at scale, which is why we need them, because obviously we were dealing here with 1.6 million tweets. So it's far too much for us to manually read. So we need to. These algorithms are our
the only way you can do it, really. I mean,
it's the only way of dealing with it. But these deep learning models, transformer-based models, build very general encodings of. Well, we fed them the last 200 tweets that each of these 10,000 accounts had sent. So not just the pro-Russian messaging, but everything else they were doing as well. And we bring that back. We encode each. It's a semantic similarity. So basically what it's really doing is it's measuring the similarity of every message with every other message that we've collected. So It's obviously like very mathematically complex series
of an individual profile or of all those profiles that you've got?
Well, so firstly, the 200 messages for each profile, then the profile, and in doing so, all the profiles.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. That is incredible.
So we bring back a encoding for each user in 768 dimensional space or something, a kind of a very high dimensionality encoding. We basically turn that into a vector position on a map. So what that is showing us is accounts which over those 200 tweets have used similar language will be close to each other, basically, and accounts which have used different language will be further away.
Okay.
And when we get the network back, you then run another algorithm on top to basically divide that into communities for you. So it says, okay, that's community, that's community, that's community, and so on. And then when we got that back, we realized that there were, and this is a kind of moment of joy as a researcher, very, very clear different kind of clusters within this network topography. So if you just get back a kind of, everything's all over the place.
All over the place.
There doesn't be any pattern.
You can't make sense of it. Yeah.
But this approach had managed to identify very clear nodes. There's a bunch of accounts there. There's a bunch of accounts up there. There's a bunch of accounts over there. And then it was really just the task of getting kind of analysts kind of manually appraising and then kind of developing a bit of a kind of framework as we went, kind of randomly selected accounts which were at the very core of each of those communities. So we select accounts that have what we call high modularity scores, but very central to each community. And that produced a network map, which I think you might have seen, which is one which shows that there are, there are accounts which and mind you, let's remember all of these accounts have shared hashtag I stand with Putin 5 or more times, or hashtag I stand with Russia. But before and after they were doing that, you've got accounts which are one cluster which is kind of pro BJP kind of Hindi language kind of Modi meme pushing spam bots. You've got a completely different kind of Indian community which is Tamil, very anti Modi up there. You've got kind of a kind of longer tunnel of kind of Indian English accounts, a completely different Pakistan and Iranian cluster, a South African kind of Nigerian kind of cluster, a very linking into a very distinct pro-Zuma, pro-BRICS cluster, and then a kind of South Asian tunnel over the top. And then this kind of, I think, quite a different operation, actually, which was this kind of a multilingual kind of primarily English language kind of spam network in a blue cluster that looked very different from the others. So this is realizing two things. Of course, what it's first realizing, this algorithm, is the actual formally the different languages that are being used. So,
and that's the algorithm, right? Just to make sure that I've understood what you mean when we're talking about it's looking for the semantic similarities and similar language use. Are we talking about the actual language, like you're saying here? You've got South Asian languages, and it's bringing it down to the actual language, the geographical language that it's speaking, or we're also talking about the context that it's, how it's using language, in relation to the hashtag stand with Putin. So it's really kind of building a dense profile of the message that's actually being seeded within this hashtag and creating a very, very dense node. And then you're overlaying over the top of that, you're then overlaying the actual national language / geographic kind of geolocation of where that message is actually. Is that being seeded? Is that broadly what it is?
So it's doing both.
Right. Incredible.
It's doing both of those things. So it's both realizing that an account that speaks in Urdu and an account that speaks in Hindi are different from each other. But then it's also realizing that two accounts speaking Hindi about football will be closer than one account speaking in Hindi about football and another speaking in Hindi about BJP.
Wow. Okay.
So it's both. To be honest, this is an interesting methodological choice we made to use. There's a number of different deep learning models. Another one would have been less sensitive to language difference, like formal language difference. So another one would have tried to translate everything into basically one common language and then go from there. So that would have been less sensitive to a Javanese and an Urdu account. If they're both talking about Chelsea Football Club, they would have been much closer to each other.
Yeah.
But to be honest, I actually didn't want that because I wanted, I thought the actual languages they're using is a really important part of the story.
Absolutely.
So I actually wanted an algorithm to be sensitive and to reflect in the output when accounts were speaking the Hindi versus Javanese or Urdu. But yeah, it is.
And why? Why? Because it strikes me as a peculiar. I think it's a hugely important point because of identity and sense of belonging and everything else. But why did you want that additional layer of the language in there as well? What was your thinking behind that?
Because I think that is one of the most important ways in which you characterize accounts. So if an account is talking in Hindi, that's an extremely important kind of behavior that the account is exhibiting versus an account in English. So bearing in mind what we're trying to do, the whole point of this research is to characterize accounts that have been pumping these hashtags. So in order to possibly say something about targeting or underlying strategy.
Right, of course, yeah.
So exactly. I mean, of course, we want to know whether it's Hindi or Urdu or Tamil. I mean, not that we were really expecting there to be such language distinction, to be honest. The beauty of research in general and perhaps this method is that you can go into it and use it without really I definitely had no expectation that I was looking for Javanese or Urdu language accounts instead.
Yeah.
Right. I thought these were going to be primarily because the hashtags are English. We didn't even translate the hashtags into I stand with Putin in Urdu, right? I was expecting most of these to be English language accounts and really, them to be talking about different things. Maybe there was going to be a Brexit cluster, maybe there was going to be a whatever, like a sports cluster or something. But kind of it recognizing that that there's a big difference in the languages, the actual languages that accounts are using is one of the important takeaways for me of this whole research. And what we basically realized was all these different language groups, none of them angled at the West at all. And I would say there's probably two things happening here in terms of how to interpret these results. Firstly, I suspect that what's happening here is an exploitation of pay-to-engage services. Okay. So we often don't talk much about like the intersection between like geopolitics and information warfare and like spam and online fraud, but they're a lot more linked than we think they are. And what I think's happening is that these are networks, perhaps different overlapping networks, that have been rented to pump this hashtag. In part, there's definitely some of them. So there are just spam bots in here. They're not real people. I think who are currently now talking about the Kashmir files or like a video release in Iran or something. But over those days, they all just switched and started. Just sharing the hashtag in very large quantities.
That struck me as incredible, and you actually have some graphs as well as to the jump in accounts from that 3rd of March onwards, for at least for some of those for some of the data sets. It's absolutely incredible. I mean, have you been able to establish why the 3rd of March? What have you been able to pinpoint to some action or something that's happened? I mean, obviously the invasion started some 10 days before then. So was this a matter of, catching up that it took him so long? I mean, or why the 3rd of March?
So this is my interpretation as a researcher now, more than like just the straight up what the data, necessarily says. But my suspicion is that this campaign was linked to the UN vote condemning the invasion. Because there's a lot of there is actually quite a lot of messaging linked to the UN vote, and it definitely kind of exploits this kind of pro-BRICS kind of solidarity kind of idea, especially with South Africa and India. What might have been happening here is this was a campaign to try and make I stand with Putin trend in these countries, both as a way of possibly influencing the kind of general populace in those countries, but also politicians, and therefore diplomatic communities that might have been on the fence or trying to decide, what to do about the vote. That is simply a possibility on the basis of what I think these influence operations are trying to do. But I mean, if you want my guess, it's that this was an attempt to target BRICS countries in the run up to the vote, to try and use kind of anti-colonial, anti-Western, longer-standing ideas in those societies to kind of puncture the picture of a global condemnation of the invasion.
Yeah, so I guess fan old flames that already exist. I guess give fuel to some of those old narratives that already exist, and amplify them. And you said a lot of those were I guess bots. Have you been able to kind of get a sense of what percentage of them were bots, and then of course how far and how wide did these messages actually spread? And of course, how effective were they? Because that's ultimately what it comes down to.
So we can never definitively call out a bot on an individual level. Like I'm much more comfortable talking about suspicious patterns at the network level because they're kind of much more empirically demonstrable to be different from an organic equivalent. I have learned.
Can you give it? Sorry to interrupt you, but just to get a bit of clarity on that, can you maybe just explain what are some of those things that would make you believe that it's likely, to be? I know you can't definitively say it's a bot, but what are some of those patterns? I know you mentioned some already, but just to recap on that before you kind of continue on. What are some of those patterns that would make you believe that it is a bot farm that you're dealing with?
Sure. I mean, well, by the way, I think some of this is paid to engage amplification. I do think there's some organic activity here as well. Right. So look, well, let's talk about the actual hashtags. So they basically come out of nowhere. It looks as if a switch has been flipped on. There's a kind of completely flat line at zero, and then on March the 2nd, it kind of spikes and starts globally trending all over the world, and then kind of sharply declines on the other side as well. You just very rarely see hashtag activity like that on Twitter.
Okay.
Societies like it kind of social momentum kind of often takes time to build up, and there'll be a discussion about it for a while, and then normally an event will cause it to rise, and it will fall and then rise again, and you just very, very rarely see a kind of from zero and then on a particular day it's suddenly exploding into kind of global resonance. Allied to that, on the kind of per account level, you've got accounts which have extremely few followers retweeting Hindi, and then suddenly sending a English language pro-invasion series of messaging which received 10,000 retweets apiece. And this account has 16 followers. It just isn't the kind of activity that, I mean, is it possible that this person is real and that just this pro-invasion meme was sent? Yes, of course it is. I mean, I don't work for Twitter and I can't look into this person's head. Yeah. Like, I am, anyone listening to this, I am willing to take basically whatever odds you want to give me, though, on this, on an account profiling like that being part of an influence operation. It just is too unlikely that kind of activity.
And at that scale, right? That many accounts.
Well, and then you have all these, then you've got all of these different networks spread around the world, Tamil, BJP, South African, South Asian, and all on March 2nd, flip, suddenly start retweeting the same English language pro-Russian memetics from the same accounts. Extremely unlikely. But plus, of course, Twitter has actually taken down some of these accounts now. So we're also seeing enforcement action on their side.
Have they approached you in any way? I mean, given that this is your research, and I'll of course share the links to at least your tweets, because the graphics themselves are just incredible, and they tell a story, and I think it's worth for people to see it. But has Twitter approached you? Have they asked engaged you in for your support in this, or to understand the ecosystem any better?
Yeah, I mean, they have. I discuss my work with Twitter quite constantly. I mean, I would say I genuinely don't think that we can do anything that Twitter can't do with their own data. I mean, they have the best data science teams, some of the best data science teams in the world, and they understand their platform, and they have way more information about their platform than I ever would. Right. The difficulty is that there is a gap, I think, between when a researcher like me can say something is super suspicious and when Twitter actually takes down tons of accounts. Because they are kind of like a mini government, of course, and they have a kind of very heavy responsibility to not start deleting normal people, and it's in that gap in many ways that information warfare inhabits. It's got to be quite suspicious, because otherwise it's not effective. If they're not pumping the hashtag, what are they doing? I mean. So they have to create suspicious patterns to have an effect. But they, it's the job of the people operating these campaigns to know, or to try and work out where the evidentiary line threshold would be for Twitter to take down, and to always stay below that. And this is I was talking about this kind of hidden conflict in a way between militaries or states and the social media platforms. Well, this is it. That kind of dynamic is exactly the kind of conflict I'm talking about, where they'll be setting up new accounts and running them, and probably doing research on the accounts that got shut down and trying to understand why they were, and Twitter's doing the on the other side trying to do the same thing, detection and enforcement.
I really like that.
It's we rarely see.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's below the kind of detection threshold. I mean, that's really where these types of kind of grey zone operations exist, right? It's also there's plausible deniability, because it's very difficult to then ultimately trace to where the originator is actually sitting. Is that, have you found that with this particular data set as well, that it's very difficult to geolocate where the buttons are actually being pushed? And of course, it doesn't matter, right? Whether it's in Moscow or Delhi, doesn't matter.
Well, so again, completely my own interpretation, but I've often found that whoever runs these campaigns sometimes slightly over eggs the kind of nationalism. So when we were doing a kind of research on say information operations around Brexit, English nationalists would have these accounts would just have a kind of wall of St. George's crosses and lions and talk about nothing else, and every tweet would be them shrouded in a in something shrouded in a Union Jack, and it's actually not particularly convincing behaviour of an English nationalist, because I mean, as I said, I used to do lots of research on the English Defence League, and they are human beings and they talk about loads of other things other than English nationalism. And in some ways, my impression about these other accounts, Hindi, BJP, it didn't. It felt like they were created by people that didn't actually understand a huge amount about the regions that they were trying to get these accounts to be part of. Now, we cannot geolocate these accounts like that. That's a kind of technical trail of breadcrumbs which Twitter might do, but which we certainly can't. So I have no idea who's operating these things. But yeah, my impression was that these weren't many of these accounts weren't intimately familiar with actually what life is like in South Africa or India or
they didn't have
or anywhere else.
They didn't have algorithms that would help them determine the semantic differences of particular areas.
Well, so this is the thing, right? Is that in information warfare, hopefully your listeners are getting a sense of also the massive difference in how easy this is to do versus how easy it is to spot. So this might have cost it, if this was a series of overlapping pay-to-engage exploitations, this might have cost them £500 to do, right? From a spammy marketing team that has maybe got a bit of training and a couple of spammy tools in order to set up an account to get them to pump hashtag. On the defensive side of this, not only do you have obviously world-class data scientists in Twitter trying to do something about this, but you've also got, on our side, we've got 2 professors of natural language processing. I've got a team of 25 developers. We do foundational research in the methodologies that we're using here. We're using next generation Google-based deep learning models, and it took us over a week to pull apart the investigation. And even now, I can't come on your show and say for sure, Maz, these are definitely bots and these are definitely Russian.
Incredible. It's incredible. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous, scary. Yeah. But of course, we also have to realize that if the West is kind of employing very similar tactics as well. We can't deny that. And of course, we've seen just recently, the group Anonymous openly side with Ukraine and openly target Russia through cyber attacks. Playing Ukrainian folk songs on Russian TV stations and intercepting the radio channels and so on and so forth. And I guess that's the point you're making, that it is war exercised in the information domain. And while we can't really, there's no blood, so to say, it's a very fine line when we then cross into the real world, and that's when people become motivated and start taking action based on the information that they're being fed. Have you seen any action being taken so far? I mean, I know it's very difficult to make an assessment of the effectiveness of any of these campaigns, but have you been able to get a sense of a growing sentiment or growing support for the Russian side of the conflict, or what's your take?
Yeah, no, I've no idea. Sadly, Maz, it's too early days. You know, this question of how online behavior translates into offline effects, attitudinal, behavioral, or otherwise, is obviously such an important one. It's in many ways the kind of holy grail of all of this research, and like in other parts of we've correlated online hate activity and offline hate crime. We've done tracking, of QAnon groups and seen how that directly translates into 5G towers being attacked. Like, we can see it. Like, there definitely is follow through, but far too early to say here. And I can't even really tell you like how much organic uptake these campaigns had so far. I mean, I think the very furthest that this research can take us so far is to suggest, if it were Russia buying this, and again, I can't guarantee that it is, but if it were, they might be going after non-Western audiences more than we think, and that perhaps leads me to kind of where some of our discussion started, which is around this idea of Ukraine winning the information war. I think if there's one message from this, it is to at least lightly suggest that just because me and you, and maybe the people listening to this, can't see pro-Russian, pro-invasion kind of messaging, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. It doesn't mean it's not working. It just means that we are not the battlegrounds that are currently being fought over. That's such
an important point, because it's very easy to fall for the trap, and especially because we have seen such humongous geopolitical shifts, from and in no small part due to these, what we perceive as the success of the Ukrainian information operations, right? I mean, we've seen countries who have been neutral for hundreds of years turn against Russia. Germany's pivoted completely. NATO's more galvanized, EU's more galvanized. So there's this, and this is something I spoke to Peter Singer about. I mean, even in the US, we're seeing people who, were, particularly Republicans who were originally pro Putin, who now kind of shifting away, because the public sentiment is shifting away from, broadly speaking, from kind of pro Russia and Putin to pro Zelensky and Ukraine. So for that very reason, it was very easy for me to speak to Peter about that, and because it's what I'm seeing, in my echo chamber. And I think that's the really important lesson here, that let's not let our hubris catch us out, like many have been caught out with Brexit, Trump, and the like.
And maybe that's the ending thought, really, which is that Zelensky's kind of great success in kind of couching this conflict as not one between Russia and Ukraine, but one between Russia and the West has consequences that we're kind of learning about now, which is that what it does do, of course, is it galvanizes and unites NATO and Europe, but it also kind of provides opportunities for Russian influence to have effects in other parts of the world that actually have much less sympathy with Western military adventurism and kind of much longer histories of real experiences of colonialism and all the abuses that they can bring, and that however spectacularly wrong it might seem to me and you to justify what is essentially a imperial invasion using anti-colonial motifs and means, that seems to be what Russia is currently doing.
Yeah, and realpolitik doesn't care what
Neither does information warfare doesn't either, because it's all about effects, behavioral effects. That is what all of it. Information sadly dies in this world because right and wrong and interesting or not, good and bad, they all become instruments to be used in for ulterior means, which is kind of quite upsetting as an author, really. But this is the world that we seem to be living in now.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, it's the death of gods, right? At the end of gods, the information is the new god. On that note, Carl, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for giving me so much of your time, and I think that's a very useful warning for us to heed. Let's not, forget that there's a battle, but there's also a bigger war at play, and let's not feel that we're winning one and then lose the other, I guess. So that's really the key message here. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Very insightful conversation.
Thanks very much, man.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please consider showing your support by liking and reviewing the show wherever you catch your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and until next time.